Dzień dobry. Dzisiaj nietypowo do mikrofonu, ale żeby nie było, że Alek będzie miał gorzej niż witający. Dzień dobry Państwu. Jakże to inaczej niż na filmach, ale bardzo się cieszę, że zaczynamy nowy cykl, za co jestem bardzo wdzięczny Annie. Anna od kilku miesięcy tak naprawdę pomaga nam tutaj w fundacji. Wzięła pod swoją opiekę nasz księgozbiór, który kiedyś otrzymaliśmy dla tego miejsca. I z tych spotkań i rozmów zrodził się pomysł na opowiadanie o sztuce. Alek, który jest mężem Anny, na co dzień jest edukatorem z dziedziny sztuki, historii sztuki, jest też pasjonatem. Przybyli do nas z Moskwy, mieszkają już kilka lat w Polsce, a obecnie w Szczecinie. Witamy w gronie Szczecinian, ale też w gronie naszego klubu. Wszelkie nieścisłości wybaczcie nam, mamy trochę więcej sprzętu niż talentu mimo pewnych doświadczeń, ale chcemy to profesjonalizować, a dzisiaj mamy pierwsze z serii spotkań. Także po wykładzie będzie możliwość do pytania Aleka o dodatkowe rzeczy, jeśli będziecie mieli taką, jeśli się pojawią pytania, ale też jesteśmy otwarci o Wasze sugestie związane z tematyką. Kto chciałby więcej się dowiedzieć o naszych gościach, to są wyłożone ulotki oraz będzie, tak jak mówię, jest to początek serii, będzie możliwość też poznawać ich przy kolejnych wykładach i sposobnościach. Jeszcze jedna kwestia techniczna a propos innowacji. Dzisiejszy wykład będzie w języku angielskim, czyli w języku, którego ja nie zdążyłem się nauczyć. Zakładam, że młodzież i większość z Państwa, niektórych znam, że wiem, że się posługujecie tym językiem, nie będzie problemu, ale ktoś, kto potrzebuje, to mamy przygotowane tłumaczenie automatyczne, usługę zacnej firmy Microsoft, przetestowaną, ale też zobaczymy, jak to nam dzisiaj posłuży i może nas otworzy na więcej spotkań w różnych językach. Także osoby, które potrzebują tłumaczenia, proszę o zająć sobie miejsce bliżej dwóch monitorów. Tam na tyłach, jeśli ktoś woli tyły, albo się wstydzi, albo tutaj bliżej. Pytania do Alka będzie można zadawać w obu językach, rozumiem język polski. Jeśli będą kłopoty, Anna będzie nam pomagała. Anna też mówi po polsku, to wykorzystamy ją, żeby też dzisiaj pracowała nie tylko mąż. Tak, tam mamy możliwość czytania i zapoznania się. Później zapis naszego spotkania znajdzie się na stronie, spotkanie się transmituje, także jak wszystko dobrze pójdzie, to jeszcze będziemy mogli wrócić i też załadujemy tłumaczenie, tak żeby na spokojnie, jeśli coś ucieknie, to żeby sobie do tego wrócić. A teraz oddaję mikrofon naszemu gościowi. Zapraszam, Alek. Proszę bardzo.
Hello everyone. Let me introduce myself one more time. My name is Alek. I am an instructional designer and I'm an art historian, and I've been teaching that for 20 years already. And I prepared a cycle of lections, but I hope the first one will go well and I will see everyone again. So today's one is about Albrecht Dürer. And I'm not going to talk about Albrecht Dürer as people usually talk about him. Usually he is mentioned as a Renaissance man, as the person who is one of the major portraits of the Northern Renaissance movement. But I'm going to talk about him as a person who created, well, the first personal brand in history. That's usually something that is not associated with Renaissance. It is something that is associated with our century, with the social networks, with everything. But why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this because the world we live in, it creates people and it creates innovations. So why initially Dürer was able to be what he is to be? I would like to first mention what time and what period he was living in. So when Dürer was born, he was born into the family of non-artists. He was born into the family of goldsmiths. And he was going to become a goldsmith, and he was being educated as one. But when he was very young, he just came up to his father and told that he's not going to be a goldsmith, which is very unusual for this time. Usually, if you are born in a family of goldsmiths at this time, you are a goldsmith. But his father was a forward-seeking looking man, so he decided to teach him art, and he gave him as an apprentice to an artist. The second thing which created Dürer as a personality, as a person, is that he was born when Europe, in general, especially Northern Europe, was in the in the rise of the movement of humanism. When person finally became the major aspect of development, when we were not seeking truth out there, when people started to seek truth, seeking personality inside themselves. Again, I'm not talking to discuss humanism very broadly today, but what is important is that Dürer's childhood went through the period when humanism was becoming popular. Why Dürer, in general, is a person who revolutionized the whole art industry back in his time. So we usually see like, okay, Dürer, this is the famous hands, this is AD monogram. We take it as the usual thing, like it was always there. So when we think about like Dürer, like Raphael, like Leonardo, and we think, okay, like this picture belongs to this artist, this picture belongs to that artist. But we never think that before Dürer, art was actually not signed much. Artists and craftsmen, they were the same thing. So you could go to a woodcutter, you could go to a goldsmith, you can go to a shoemaker, or you could go to an artist. And they were approximately the same thing. They were craftsmen. Therefore, like when you buy a chair, it doesn't have a signature of a person who produced the chair, even if you know him. So the same thing was with the art back at his time. So you can see that usually the pictures that depicted like a workshop where goldsmiths work or like somebody else work, and the workshop where artists work, they looked approximately the same. So there was a couple of chief artists who already knew their trade, and a lot of people who worked for them. Like they were working almost like a conveyor. So the chief artist would be doing the major sketch or the idea, and his apprentices, the people who were working for him, they were creating the colors and the outlines, but they were never signed. What Dürer changed is that he was the first person, well, almost the first person. Before Dürer, we had some, so there were probably, these people, and the works of art. So it's Botticelli, it's Van Eyck, it's Donatello. They occasionally signed their works, especially Van Eyck. Van Eyck could be the separate topic for discussion in the separate lecture, but the idea is that pictures were like signed not because it was important that it was created by Botticelli. It was signed because it was documentation of something. Dürer signed his work because they were his, and he wanted the world to know they were his. What else changed it? So, okay, he signed his works, no big deal. He was proud, maybe that was just pride. But the interesting thing is that before Dürer, artists were mostly dependent on the money that were going to them from their patrons. So they were usually sponsored by, I don't know, by Roman Catholic Church, by aristocracy, by rich merchants, but only with the people who have generally much more money than the average population. There was no middle class before that. But again, during the Renaissance period, there was the emerging middle class who had slightly more money than everybody else, but still not enough money that the people who would sponsor art and make expensive purchases. And again, if some artist before that went out of fashion, or some artist lost the patron, it could be anything, a conflict like death of a patron, they lost the money. So that's why a lot of artists couldn't secure themselves financially. Historically, Albrecht Dürer was the first artist who could create the stable chain of income as an artist. He took the technology that appeared when he was a child. He took printmaking. Printmaking is something that will allow you to create the work of art once and then print it and distribute it for much less money than the bigger oil painting back at this time. So they were slightly cheaper wooden, like woodcuts, so like pictures that were created on wood and then printed, or there could be like linocuts or anything, like pictures that were created on metal and then printed. They usually had more details. But what he did is, when he opened his workshop, he oversaw the creation of the prints that he himself sketched and created. So he employed other engravers, and he gave them the opportunity also to earn money, and he sold these engravings to middle class, to larger population. He created art as a commodity, as something that you could buy, resell, that you could collect. This is how we practically see art today also. So some collectors would buy this. And these two pictures, these two prints, I think you know them. It's one, I think most of his famous work, it's Night, Death and Devil and Melancholia 1. They were distributed, they were the first prints that were distributed not just in Germany, that were distributed across the Europe and sold internationally with his monogram. Again, what was the interesting thing that actually again makes us talk about Dürer creating a personal brand? Of course, we can speak about his monogram, we can speak about even the symbolism in his pictures, and we can say, you would say that the Night, Death and Devil, they mostly represent his spiritual turmoil and his spiritual seeking. He was, well, I wouldn't say that he was a disturbed man, but he was in a constant spiritual search throughout his life. He shared the ideas of humanism at the same time he was deeply Catholic person, and he remained Catholic to the rest of his life, but he was mostly friends with Protestants, and he shared these ideas and the ideas of humanism, and that we can see that from a lot of his correspondence with other people, with other important people like Erasmus of Rotterdam during his lifetime. We can see, like in Melancholia 1, actually it's a big question why it's 1, which is also for discussion, which represents the intellectual search of a person. It's a lot of symbolism. I'm not going to delve in a lot of detail now, but what is interesting is that these two prints and his collection of religious prints about the life of Mary, they were copied largely, and not by his workshop. They were copied, and he, as the initial author of this prints, he never received any money for that, which saddened him. And we come to the history, so we come to the idea, I would skip this for a second, so that's his monogram, which I didn't show it, in case you don't know. I think everybody knows. But this person, Raimondi, it's a Venetian printmaker, very popular in his time. He, well, because of this story, he actually received a position in Raphael's workshop, and Raphael was a friend of Dürer, so it's also an interesting thing. But this person created copies of the series of prints made by Dürer, so the Life of Virgin series of prints, and Melancholia 1, and Night, Death and Devil, so the most popular one. They were like blockbusters back at his time. But he copied them, including Dürer's initials, these ones that we were discussing, and he was selling them in Venice. And when Dürer found out about the situation, he was furious. He actually went to Venice and he filed a legal case trying to protect his trademark. It was the first legal case. It created a precedent as the first artist in history who tried to protect the authorship, rights. He, like, I wouldn't say that he won this case. Raimondi, he was, well, he still, after like the court looked into this case, he was still able and resell Dürer's prints, but they made him exclude his initials from the prints, so the prints that he was selling, they were not attributed to Dürer anymore. So it was the first partial success in protecting his trademark. Well, he was the first person to make this trademark, to make his branding, and he protected it. Dürer in general, again, being a very deeply religious person, had the struggle of being modest and being not modest at all. What I mean here is, if we read his diaries, and we have a lot of them, not all of them are available online or in print, but they're available in libraries. We can read his correspondence with various people, important people who shaped humanism, who shaped Reformation, who shaped history during his time. And he always was trying to mention that God gave him talent, and he must respect this talent, and he must develop this talent, and he must be seen, which is very like a humanistic approach to a person, but it was unusual back at his time. A person as an individual was not important. Individualism was viewed as something especially, it was viewed as pride. And if we speak about pride, we can look at this portrait. It's one of the most famous pictures created by Dürer, which is not an engraving. I used it as the illustration for the whole lecture here. This picture is called Self-Portrait at the Age of 28, which, well, basically is a portrait of Dürer himself when he was 28. And what is unusual in this portrait is that before, exactly this position of a person sitting for the portrait was connected only to religious paintings. He depicted himself like before him only Christ would have been depicted. So if we look approximately the same year, like the previous year, this is Salvator Mundi by Leonardo, which, of course, Dürer would know works by Leonardo. They were not acquainted personally, but it was impossible that they were not too. They could have been acquainted through Raphael, which they had and they had a very lifelong correspondence. So I'm absolutely sure that he knew this picture, and he created this. If you look, the gesture of his hand actually resembles the gesture of Jesus' hand. the hairstyle, everything resembles Jesus. He wasn't trying to compare himself with a god. That was not the, like, again, according to his diaries. What he was trying to do is to portray himself as the image of God as he saw himself. He tried to strategically position himself as an important human being and an important person during his lifetime. He positioned, like, a lot of art historians actually believe that this was a strategic portrait, that he did that on purpose because this portrait created a scandal back at this time. There were street fights, which is, well, it's black PR, if you can call it like this, I think. But the thing is that this portrait, which usually we see like, yeah, that's a master portrait of a very talented artist, which is actually for this time is even more talented. It's exceptional detail, and the overall painting is very skilled. But again, this is the image of God, and he depicted himself as God, and that was his strategic promotion, as a lot of, like, again, art historians believe right now. Because after he made this portrait public, he actually started the distribution on Melancholia one also. That was an advertisement. It was I wouldn't say that it was a PR company, but that was something that created a very big sound to his name. We can see also, so like we discussed this, but this strategy that Dürer used during his lifetime was never used before him. But after him, his experience, it created precedent. It created the whole line of artists who started to sign their works. We have collections right now, so like when you go to a museum and you see like this picture was created by this artist, this picture was created by that artist, and you start seeing these signatures that they belong to the paintbrush of this person. That is belong. He had but he tried to sue the Italian printmaker. Because of this legal case, a lot of artists actually have their signatures under their works. And a lot of artists after Dürer started to create engravings out of their original oil paintings and also distribute them publicly. It created a trend. Dürer himself actually just didn't try to only communicate to the general public. He was a Renaissance man. What a Renaissance man is that it is an artist, a philosopher, a scientist. He studied through all his lifetime. He published mathematical, anatomical research. He traveled vastly, which was also like not so very common back at his time. He had correspondence, like I said, with a lot of major minds of his time. And what is interesting is that the diaries of Dürer, they do not tell us about his mathematical research. We have his works, so they are published, they're available in the libraries. We have his prints, we have his legacy. But if you read his diaries, you'll see a very common person. So his diaries basically say, like, okay, I traveled to Italy and I'm very famous there and they pay me a lot of money, but when I return back home, no one pays me money. Why? Or he would write something like, okay, I had the wonderful dinner with Emperor Maximilian I, and they were like this, and that, and like he also paid me a lot of money, and I bought myself a pair of white gloves, and I'm so cool and I'm so talented. Thanks God for that. This is what you read in his diaries. Usually when you say like, oh, Dürer was a great artist, well, he was, but he also was a man, a person that wouldn't be thinking about creating the legacy of the lifetime, the legacy of the generation, who would think about his career and his own development. So what I'm trying to say here is, when we see the works of famous artists, I'm practically speaking here of Renaissance. I'm speaking here about big names like Dürer, like Raphael, like Leonardo, like Michelangelo. We typically see them as masters, which they were, of course, but we never see them as people. We never see their conflicts. We never see their everyday life. We never think about what made them what they were. What made Dürer, what made him known to us today, why he created this, why this became popular. We never think about them. Of course, we discuss philosophy of his works a lot, but we never read what he thought about himself. The same thing about like Leonardo. We can discuss that a lot. But what I'm trying to say is that Dürer was, I think, one of the first people who thought like we are thinking today. And I would remind you, that was like in 1500s. That was very long time ago. And he took the new technology that appeared in his time, the printmaking, and he used it to develop his sphere. He took his pride as a normal person has pride, and tried to protect it legally and created a precedent. He tried to understand more that was told to him constantly on a regular basis. And he also created a very successful running business. He had a large workshop, he had very rich patrons that helped him financially and invested in his startups. And he also had the opportunity to distribute his cheaper work among the middle class. This is the business models we use right now in most cases. And he was the person who created it. I wanted actually to maybe talk a little bit about this picture, because surprisingly, you all know it. It's the famous rabbit. Why I'm talking about it? I think this rabbit represents Dürer's personality a lot. This is just, probably that was his dinner, you know, like something that his, I don't know, like the person who was cooking for him was bringing into the house or something, and he just asked to put it on the table to make a sketch. He was constantly making sketches, he was constantly searching something, and he was constantly learning. And what is interesting about this rabbit, so if you look into his eye, like, I will try to come and show. If you look into his eye here, that's the reflection of Dürer's studio. That's the reflection of the window in Dürer's studio. This is the detail. This is not just the rabbit. This is the attention to detail that characterizes this person as a genius of his time. For he could live in our time, but he lived in 1500s. I think I didn't want to make this lecture a very long one, and I didn't know if it would be convenient for everyone to listen to me. So I tried to be short, and if what I'm talking about is generally interesting to anyone but me, I would be glad to discuss it. So, what I wanted to discuss mostly, it would be this. Again, a lot of art historians believe that this is him representing himself as a Christ, and a lot of art historians believe that it was the conscious act of self-promotion. So he did that on purpose to become known. I would like to discuss that with you. So if you have any ideas, like, do you agree with that? Or maybe you don't agree with that? Because I think that it might be a little bit outstretched. He just liked himself. But ideas are welcome. I guess no one, for now. Yeah, he was. Now, if we speak about his religious inner search, it actually was very interesting. Again, like I said, he was Catholic for the whole his life, but he was born in the time when Reformation came to power, so the Protestantism was raising, and he was in a part of Europe when it was raising. And most of his friends were Protestant. And he agreed with the humanistic ideas of person-centristic. I think what he wanted to show is that he, as a person, he was created in God's image, and that he has the right to depict himself in the God's image. I think this is what I think he was trying to say with this. Oh, sorry, I'm going to drop something here. Okay, does anyone else want to share? Actually, it's a very interesting question. Well, he was very big friends with Maximilian the First, who was the emperor of the Holy Rome. And that kind of gave him the green light to do more than everybody else at his time could. He had a backup, but that angered, well, let's put it like this, it angered church on like places. So some of the churches prohibited him from entering the premises. Some of the churches didn't. So it created the conflict inside Nuremberg a lot. But this conflict was relatively short-lived, because when he engaged in such conflicts, he usually contacted his like higher patrons who lived in Rome, which gave him like, again, the green light in a lot of places. He had very strategic partnerships. So, like, but it's actually an interesting question. Do you find this portrait offensive? Okay. Anyone else? Yeah, it has. Here it is. You can see it. All of his works are signed. And even if you look at his oil paintings, you would say that, for example, if it's a portrait of some lady, or if it's, I don't know, just random thing, the portrait of the lady would have the AD monogram of the trim of her dress. Or that could be, you know, like an apple under the legs of some animal which would have this monogram. He would hide it somewhere. Sometimes he wouldn't hide it and it would be on like really big. Sometimes he would hide it. But in most cases it was always there. He started, you know, like he started putting this monogram on his pictures when he was 14. He lived until he was 56. And from 14, when he was first like creating his first works, he started to put this monogram. He created a lot of art which was considered experimental back at his time. He created art with naked males, which was very unconventional back of his time, because if it was the depiction of a naked male, that was a depiction of a saint, typically. He created man in public, he painted man in public bath. And he made an engraving. And he sold this engraving with man in public bath. Well, they mostly like covered in most strategic places, but the fact, this is something that wasn't done before him. When we think about art, and when we, again, like when we go to the museums, we see a work of art, and this work of art for us is normal. We take it as a norm. Okay, so this is a naked lady, this is a Roman god, this is some secular painting, this is that. But the point is that if we look at it with period eye, and what I teach during, like my students, for example, to look at everything from the point of period eye. A period eye, when we try to look at the work that we're seeing from the point of view of the person when this work of art was created. So imagine that you are a person who lives somewhere in 1500s in Germany. Well, Nuremberg was a big trade city. It was much bigger and louder than it is today, but it was still like just a city in the middle of Europe. And imagine that you are a middle-class merchant. Well, like all of us are mostly middle-class merchants. So imagine that you just, I don't know, go to the local pub on Fridays, that you go to church on Sundays, that you live your normal life. But suddenly something, like absolutely extraordinary happens. Like you see a scandalous movie on TV and you start discussing it. Or you read an absolute scandalous book, something that wasn't done before. It amazes you, and you live in the world which is surrounded by information. We have internet. He didn't. When he started selling engravings of this, that created a riot. People were standing in queues to purchase them. They were pre-ordered like luxury items today. And the more he created, actually, the cheaper they become. So that was an interesting thing. And he created these pictures, actually, as a lot of people back at his time. I'm going to later, maybe next time when we meet, I'm going to speak about Boss. He created his pictures. Yeah, of course, like I said, symbolism, everything. But these pictures were to them as blockbusters in the cinema to us. When they purchased this picture, they wouldn't just put it on the wall. They would be looking at it, they would be discussing it, they were delving into the symbolism, they would be reading it, they would be watching it like we watch movies and read books. Like artists, created discussable, artists either created a status symbol, especially before Dürer, like during maybe Van Eyck, for example, like slightly before Dürer, and during the Dürer's time, they would be creating either status points. So you would go to the museum, you would see a lot of pictures which show a secular painting, like a virgin or Jesus or angels or whatever, and some small little figures sitting, like of just some strange people, or that would be Mary and some merchant guy next to Mary. These are the status portraits. Actually, Dürer was also making them. It was like, I don't know, like an expensive photo shoot right now. So you have a favorite saint, you want to be painted with this favorite saint, you want to be seen painted with this favorite saint, and you want everybody to know how much money you paid for that. So this is actually like what Dürer was also trying to escape at some point. He wanted to make art accessible to larger audience. He wanted to educate. That was also important. So yeah. Van Eyck. Yeah. Actually, it's an interesting question. They would sign some of the works that they would perform from the very beginning to the very end by their own hands. But the works that is performed, for example, by them and mostly by their apprentices in their workshops, they wouldn't be signed. Say, of course, if we look at these pictures, again, we all know that the Arnoldini portrait, the David, or the Venus, they were signed because they belonged to the actual hands of the actual people. Well, the Armafili portrait is literally, this picture is the subject of a separate lecture. I love it, really. It's so many theories, but the idea is that, for example, if we look at these three, okay, why do I do this? I can show it like here. If we look, that Donatello signed this David because it was the first male nude statue since the antiquity. Before him, yeah, we all have, we go to the museum, we see Roman, Greek statues of male nudes, but after that, during the medieval times, during the later antique times, people were always wearing clothes. Well, because before humanism it was never a thing. So Donatello was the first person since antiquity to depict a naked male body. He signed it because he wanted to be remembered. If we speak about the Arnolfini portrait in the middle, we would actually say, so you would say that basically the signature in the back of the picture says that Van Eyck was here and he saw what is happening. In theory, they tried to describe this portrait like it could be a legal document. One of the theories that it's not even an official portrait, that it's a legal document which gives the power of attorney to one of these people, probably his wife was dead and he needed that. If we speak about the Botticelli was creating, he was interesting because he was signing female portraits a lot. He wanted, I guess, to be remembered for that, but again, absolutely not all of them, and he created a lot of his Venus portraits. A lot of Venus-like pictures are attributed to him, but we never know is it him or not. A lot of pictures that we see in the museums, and you see the picture, this is Raphael, okay, Raphael signed his pictures. We see that it's Donatello, it is Botticelli, or it's Van Eyck. And sometimes, if the museum is modern and has a good curatorship, you would say a question mark in brackets. But in most cases, they won't. Half of the portraits you see in the, okay, not half, 1/3, you would see in the museums, which are signed with big names, are attributed to these big names because we don't know. Actually, there is an interesting story. In Warsaw, there is a work which is called A Man in the Yellow Hat, which is attributed to Dürer. It even has the monogram. You've probably seen it. But the thing is that the recent research shown that it might be fake. And again, we don't know, because some scientists believe that this portrait belonged to the workshop of Dürer, and maybe he made the sketch and everybody else made everything else. Maybe it was faked much later, maybe not. But the thing is that we don't know. Even with Dürer, sometimes we don't know. So his initials even now don't give us guarantee. Well, because he was faked a lot in most cases. Okay, do you have, maybe you have some other questions about Dürer or about Renaissance, Northern Renaissance art, or maybe Italian Renaissance, which is not the topic today, but okay. he again he created multiple source of income. He had a classical for his time source of income, so he had rich patrons who would order him larger and more expensive works of art, which we would consider luxury at our time. And he had a so-called middle market, which we're discussing here. It was his prints. And even here, he had two different types. He had woodblock prints, which were cheaper. They would produce thicker lines. They would produce less clear picture, but they were extremely affordable. You could buy that for a cup of beer, like for a pint. And he created, so that was like, yeah, that was a print machine, but the original, model, it was carved on wood, then it was in the ink, then it was printed on the paper, and that was done by people in his workshop, and he was overseeing this. And slightly more expensive ones, that would be, I think, considered like middle market. He created like on metal plates, usually, that would produce thinner lines. Actually, these ones are a good example. Where is it? So these ones are a good example of exactly metal plated engravings. They would give these tiny small lines that would give extremely intricate details, and these ones were expensive. So in this case, he actually occupied all all layers of market. He occupied the luxury sphere, he occupied the middle sphere, and the segment, and he occupied the cheaper segment. And it was mass produced, like you said. So he was able, with the money he received from his investors, let's put it like this, he was able to open a large workshop and employ a lot of engravers that were doing this work for him. So he was creating an initial model, and there were like 50 people printing it out and selling them out, even to the other countries, because he had a very large network outside of his country. In Italy, with the Italian Renaissance, with the Southern Renaissance, in Netherlands, and he sent his works here because it's paper, it's easy to send in large quantities. So even transportation was working. So yeah, he was creating as much as possible, and that created him a very successful financial, like, he was the artist who was at his time was the most financially secure one. He ran his business with the help of his wife, actually. He got married when he was very young. They never had any children. They were married for 30 years. I think that was mostly, like strategic marriage, that there was not consummated marriage. Dürer was not known to be interested in any kind of relationships, like at all, with any person. I guess he was married to his work. But the idea is that was just a corporation ran by two people. Like we see it right now. So most successful businesses are working like he's working, and he reinvested money that wasn't done with him before. So if he received the money from the sales he created, he reinvested it back into the business. Well, there were a lot of engravers. It was not, like something unique. If you buy the print, and for example, like this, and you bring it to the to a professional engraver, he could copy it on a wood plate or on a metal plate. Of course, that would cost money, but that would allow you to have the same thing, almost the same thing. It just, it would belong to the hand of the wrong person. Right now, if we speak about collectors, about people who collect works of Dürer and who collect his prints, modern people, I mean, that's a real challenge to find a real Dürer, because mostly what it is in the antique markets and antique art market would be copies of copies of copies created during Dürer's time. That was a very easy thing to do. You bring the picture, the artist of any level of skill copies it, you can reprint it and resell it as many times if you want. That's why make actually Dürer so angry. That's why he sued this person in Italy. He was, well, this guy, I mentioned him, Raimondi. He was a very talented and very professional engraver, and his works, actually the work you see here, belongs not to Dürer but to him. I mean, it's a copy by Raimondi of Dürer. His works were good. They wouldn't almost like indistinguishable from the original Dürer. That what made him angry. Well, he was very scandalous person in general. Yeah, he had a great career. He worked in Raphael's workshop. He never achieved it like higher than an employer in Raphael's workshop, and he ended up in prison for mass producing erotic prints. So that's it. That was the end of his career. Partially. He was successful. Well, Dürer made him legally exclude his initials from the copies, but he wasn't able to stop him from copying and reselling the prints. So he would still resell the prints which were copied from Dürer, but the famous monogram, the AD monogram, was absent from them. So he was able to protect his, well, his brand, but he wasn't able to protect the authorship of his works. Well, he was great friends with Raphael. They exchanged pictures, sketches. They were writing to each other for their whole lives. He, of course, well, he mentioned once Leonardo in his diaries when he died and said that, like, okay, he was a great man. I think he was envious, to be honest. He was in, he communicated mostly with philosophers and writers. He was great with Erasmus of Rotterdam, the great humanist, but the great like Protestant actually, and in most cases he cross-promoted among the artists. So Raphael promoted him in Italy, and he promoted Raphael in northern Renaissance countries, yeah, like which is like Germany, Netherlands, that would be like here, like in Poland, that was all areas of northern Renaissance. So they promoted each other. So his biggest artist friend was Raphael. Yeah, of course. Moreover, Dürer actually started a trend, because other artists, when they see that, it's like, whoa, that's possible. I can make the piece of art once and sell it multiple times. They started doing that as well. So we know that during like the later stages of his life, Leonardo started making a lot of prints, even actually very interesting ones with the optical illusions, which sold nicely because it was optical illusions and it was interesting to see. There were, artists which were less successful and that would maybe sell their piece of art to like merchant level patrons, which would buy something and they would have to leave that for the and then they would just make the same portrait of a random merchant guy in a print and sell it multiple times. Actually, that's a lot of funny stories used to it, that there were like lawsuits when these portraits were used by the enemies of these merchants, or like someone was throwing knives into them and so on. It's a lot of anecdotes, but that's already jokes. Most of them like written, most of them are just rumored, so you never know. Actually, I would say that I mentioned Salvator Mundi by Leonardo, and I mentioned that Dürer created it like literally approximately at the same time. I think he didn't mention Leonardo in his diaries on purpose, because like, come on, he was envious a little bit, I think. But we could literally say that, well, Raphael was envious because he had a professional rivalry with Michelangelo, later in Leonardo. It's this artistic community back at Renaissance time, it's much more connected than we like think about it, because these people usually were in correspondence. They knew each other even through the through several handshakes. Any more yeah, okay. So I hope that what I told here today was interesting, and I actually hope that you liked it. I would like to talk more about different art, and I would like to see all of you once again. The next time I'm going to talk here, I'm going to talk about Bosch. And I'm going to talk about him not from the point of view of, like, look, the weird pictures by Bosch. We all know the weird pictures by Bosch. But why, well, approximately why what Bosch was created was the same thing that Marvel Studios are creating right now. So I'm going to speak about it from this point of view and explain why. And if you're interested, well, feel free to come and discuss it with me. Thank you very much.